Since the beginning of human civilization, humans have sought out entertainment. Children often played with a variety of toys, things like dolls, balls, bows and arrows, really anything they could mold with their imagination. And although this is a fairly innocent view of things, toys would not be the only entertainment for the human species. Especially as children evolved into adulthood, it seemed like dolls no longer really became a source of entertainment for most, and so they turned towards super fun activities like, killing people, watching people get killed, gorging themselves with food, poisoning their own bodies, and of course, a variety of, let's say, adulterous activities. And although in a time where education was not always considered a pillar of a great society, hindsight might make us think that entertainment that required skill and critical thinking was off the table outside of the brute sport of combat. But often overlooked is the games of wit of the past, and few have stood the test of time more than the simple concept of a card game. The origins of the card game can be considered very murky, so please, bear with me as I try to piece together the confusing and sometimes conflicting details of the playing card. But from what I've gathered in my research, somewhere in the Tang Dynasty between 618 and 907 AD, there are references to a game invented by the Chinese people called Yezige. I tried to figure out how to pronounce that, not sure to be honest, but it roughly translates in English to the game of leaves, with some historians believing that these leaves were actually playing cards. And for some people, this belief is still held, but for a good amount of scholars in the field, this initial assessment of leaves being a translation to essentially the modern-day playing card, it's somewhat contested. It seems that the most widely held belief is that Yezige is actually a game played with dice and possibly a board game, but with the leaves instead being pages from an instruction book or essentially a money equivalent, kind of like a poker chip. So although we can't be certain on this being the origin of playing cards, it does serve as a possibility, but without much knowledge on how this game is played, we really can't definitively say. That being said, it doesn't seem too implausible that the playing card and/or card game could have originated from China, as the country would be the birthplace of paper, with the suggestion of a paper-like substance being used for wrapping items in China as early as 200 BC, with it being vastly improved a few centuries later, around 100 AD, by a court official named Kai Lun, who would introduce the process of adding wood pulp to make paper. This process would be a revolutionary landmark in the production of paper as a medium for writing, only further being revolutionized by the country sometime in the late 7th century with the introduction of the earliest form of printing, woodblock printing. A process that essentially involved carving text or images onto a woodblock, putting ink on that block, and then pressing paper against the block. So kind of like a big wooden stamp. This invention would line up with around the time frame that historians speculate Yezige was introduced, but because the rules are seemingly lost to time, we're still left in the dark about whether we can consider it the first ever card game. That being said, what we're a bit more certain about is that as the world entered the new millennium after 1000 AD, the idea of playing games with cards seemingly began to spread throughout the Asian continent, with the general conclusion being that they did in fact originate in China, with other possibilities including countries with records of playing cards at the time, including India, Persia, Korea, and/or Egypt. And wherever the playing card would go, desire to have them by the general population would also grow, with playing cards being particularly common to entertain army forces as they marched from location to location, further spreading their militaristic influence. Now, what did they play with these cards exactly? I'm quite honestly entirely unable to find almost any information on this, but whatever they were doing would seemingly capture the attention of European traders, as through the Mamluk Empire of Egypt, playing cards would make their first landfall in Europe, speculated to first land in Italy or the Islamic regions of Spain in the late 1300s. By the time that they arrived in Europe, the card suit system that we similarly see in modern day playing cards had developed, with each region having their own wildly different takes on these suits. As they originated from Egypt, the original suits used by the Mamluks were swords, polo sticks, cups, and coins, and this would be mirrored when they made their way over to Europe, with both Spain and Italy adopting the suits of swords, cups, and coins. And because polo was unknown by the Europeans at the time, polo sticks would eventually be swapped out for batons and/or clubs. Because all cards were hand-painted at the time, cards were initially seen as something as a bit of a luxury only afforded to those with a decent degree of wealth. Although this assumption may simply have been a bias caused by the only best produced and most expensive cards holding up long enough to be recorded by history. Now, games are obviously being played with these cards at the time, but the specificity of these games remains a bit unknown. But one game from Germany in particular would emerge in the mid-1420s as one of the first ever recorded card games called Karnaffel. Karnaffel? I don't know. Was first allowed to be played at a 1426 festival in the Bavarian region of modern-day Germany. The game, although thought to be lost to time, was seemingly found to still be played in a small remote village in Switzerland in the 1970s, allowing us to understand a bit of the rules. The game would function as what's defined as a trick-taking card game, where certain cards would beat others. This game had unique card variations, where certain cards were counted as popes, kaisers, devils, with certain number cards or other of these card variations beating the other depending on the chosen lucky suit for the game. The game is cited as influencing other card games with its introduction of this certain, rock, paper, scissors dynamic for a card game, with direct offshoots of the game still existing today in a small capacity, with games like Bruce, Newfoundland, Kaiserspiel, and Stierrevolt. Stierrevolt. It's worth noting, however, that although Carnival is still played today, it's suspected that this version is different than the original, meaning we may never know the true rules for the game. As cards made their way across Europe, countries continued to make their own variations of the suits, with Germans flipping the whole script, opting to go with hearts, bells, acorns, and leaves, with our lovely Frenchmen introducing us to the classic suits that we know and use today around 1480, the heart, club, diamond, and spade, with the suits later being adopted by the English. Although these varying suits across these regions would be the most common, there were often many offshoots and changes in these suits that would emerge from singular producers or from small communities within a country. Some even adding or removing the total amounts of suits in a deck to include 3 or 5. Things were kind of all over the place. Most decks would include the standard 1 to 10 for each suit, but where we'd see the variation was commonly in the face cards, with others later evolving to include extra face cards such as the Queen, or swapping out the names of certain cards such as having the Knave be the Prince, or eventually the Jack. Because of their explosion of popularity in Europe, some regulation was put into place in certain countries to ban their use, mainly to target the unholy act of gambling. This would occur across various regions all across Europe over the next century, with one of the first recorded bans in 1376 in Florence, Italy, banning the game Nabe. These bans would be occasionally lifted either because of new leaders in the ruling class or for special festivals, such as in the one in 1426 that would see the emergence of the game Carnival. Carnival introduced the concept of triumph or trump cards. These cards essentially served as overpowered cards that took precedence over other cards in the suit. Variations of these would emerge and soon to become known as tarot cards, with 1440s Italy often being cited as the originator of these cards. These decks included a total number of 21 Triumph cards plus a card called the Fool that served in addition to the 56 card decks, causing the decks to have 78 cards in total. These cards enabled the playing of specific games with slight variations, with the most popular tarot game being French tarot. The 1440s would also give birth to the French card game, 31. A game in which the goal was for each player to receive cards from a deck that would add up as close as possible to the number 31, with any amount over 31 resulting in defeat. This game was obviously a progenitor to 21 or blackjack, with the only real difference being that the target goal was being to 21 instead of 31. In the 1440s would not stop there, as 1441 would see the creation of a game, also in France, called Poke. Now this game, and maybe the name gave it away, is considered to be the possibly oldest ancestor of poker, featuring bluffing as a key component of the game. And over the next few centuries, many different card games would appear and evolve. Some would take off, only to be further adapted and malformed until they were barely recognizable from their original self, morphed into a new species altogether, while some were undoubtedly disregarded and not even given the dignity of being remembered by anyone, almost entirely lost to time. The 16th century would see a large amount of card games being played, with new variations popping up all over the place as the world continued to fall in love with the endless possibilities of a deck of cards. Primero was one of the most popular card games at the time and was seemingly said to have influenced poker, featuring bluffing as well as certain hand types that mimicked poker hands. One notable game invented in the late 16th century that would quickly become one of the most popular games of the 17th century was the Spanish game Hombre. Hombre is, to put it in very simple terms, as my brain doesn't really understand the complexities of this sort of thing, it's a three-way duel of matching whatever suit is selected as the trump card for the round, with the ability for certain cards to override the trump card in the middle. The game Cribbage would also emerge from the UK at this time, which would essentially be a fancier version of the previously mentioned 31, this time introducing a funny little pegboard they decided to rip from another earlier game called Noddy. Now at this point in history, card games were growing exponentially large, which makes it exceptionally hard to try to go through and catalog each notable card game that did emerge, especially as card games would take over to the Americas, where even more variations of existing card games would emerge, especially in the United States. Card games had now become deeply ingrained in almost every culture in the world, with each region and communities in those regions likely having their own favorite way to play with a deck. As we entered the 1800s, America would give birth to some fairly iconic and renowned card games like euchre, but most notably of all was poker. Although its origin is still a bit speculated, most seem to believe that it originated around the 1830s, more than likely from gambling boats that would float down the Mississippi River around the New Orleans area. Another notable exception from this century would be the creation of bridge, also known as contact bridge. And although playing cards had been the rage for the past, I don't know, like a millennia or so, nothing too long, a new type of card would begin its meteoric rise, the collectible trading card. Starting around 1860, we would begin to see the first ever baseball cards. These cards featured a varied mix of painted player portraits and photographed pictures of players, and were more commonly used by companies to advertise their businesses. One of the earliest ways these baseball cards were distributed was, of course, through packs of cigarettes. To ensure that cigarettes would not get crushed on the pack, cigarette companies used paper cards called stiffeners to add a bit of durability to their packs. And it would not be long after this introduction, however, that someone had the ingenious idea of printing small pictures on these cards. These cards would come in a variety of different sets based on the manufacturer, with special themes being used for each set, with some eventually receiving text on the back to provide information about the picture on the front of the card. Although the cards distributed in these packs did contain their own sets of trading cards, often included in these packs as well were a variety of baseball cards. And for whatever reason, these were a smash hit. By the early 1900s, people were fanatically looking to collect cards like they were hotcakes. In America, people were particularly focused on baseball cards, especially children, and because a lot of these cards were included in cigarette packs, you would commonly see crowds of children waiting outside stores to beg for these cards from adults buying packs of cigs. Now, outside of just cigarette companies, candy companies were also another common avenue for distributing baseball cards, but it would be the cigarette companies that would be responsible for one of the most sought-after series of all time, the American Tobacco Company's T206 White Border set of 1909. From this set would birth the highly sought-after T206 Honus Wagner, a card made increasingly valuable after Honus would reject the offer from the company to put his face on their cards, causing only a small amount to ever be produced. In 2022, a Honus Wagner card would sell for $7.25 million. So, not a bad return on investment for a pack of cigarettes. Although baseball cards would take a brief break in manufacturing during the First World War as resources were rerouted into, more important matters. After the war was over, though, manufacturing would pick right back up. Over the next few decades, interest in baseball cards would wax and wane, but they did remain a constant, with a variety of notable sets coming out during this time. By the end of World War II, due to their continued popularity, certain companies began to specialize into producing baseball cards, with Bowman being the first in 1948. Chewing gum packs also became eventually a staple for baseball cards, with the company Topps being one of the most notable producers of baseball cards, eventually surpassing and buying out Bowman. Topps' 1952 set would become one of the most popular sought-after sets in history, particularly because it contained the rookie card for a little-known player called Mickey Mantle. This card stands as the most expensive baseball card of all time, with it selling in 2022 in mint condition for a modest $12.6 million. With the success Topps saw, they were eventually able to buy out Bowman only a few years later in 1956. And the next few decades would see them conquer the trading card scene, with some of their most notable packs being Star Wars trading cards, Garbage Pail Kids, and a variety of other sports trading cards. While collectible trading cards were seeing a rise, so was the world of professional gambling, mainly with poker. In 1969, the first event for the World Series of Poker would be held in the city of Reno, known as the Texas Gamblers Reunion, as the name World Series of Poker was still not yet established. After a win from the now-renowned Crandall Addington, Addington would eventually have some conversations with a Las Vegas casino owner by the name of Benny Binion, owner of the Binion Horseshoe. Now, Binion was an interesting man, and by interesting, I mean a murderer and a racist. Born and raised in the good old state of Texas, his first run-in with the law was for moonshining at the age of only 18. But, not a huge deal. But this would be then followed up in 1931 when he would shoot and kill a man, only to be left off with essentially no consequences. And this would not be the only man he was responsible for killing, as Binion was actually the head of a mob gang that ran illegal gambling operations, and not only openly admitted to the previous killing, but would later admit to killing a rival gambling den operator by the name of Ben Frieden. But he was able to get off in both cases due to apparent self-defense, although he later admitted to shooting himself in the arm after sneaking up and shooting Frieden in his car to make it look that Frieden had fired the first shot. And he would later have to flee to Las Vegas after a new sheriff took over the town that no longer allowed him to pay off local officials. And it was during this time where he would open his own casino in Vegas, also taking a page out of H.P. Lovecraft's book where he would buy an all-black horse and would lovingly name it the Hard R, where it would go on to be the National Cutting Horse Association World Champion 3 years in a row. But with the help of Binion, in 1970, Addington and Binion would officially form the World Series of Poker after spending the year drafting a variety of prestigious players throughout the country, with famous player Johnny Moss winning the main event of Texas Hold'em. Over the years since its inception, the tournament would grow, increasing not only the overall popularity of the game of poker, but becoming the largest poker tournament in the world. A year later in 1971, a man by the name of Merle Robin in the small town of Readings, Indiana, would come up with a brand new card game you might have heard of called Uno. After having a few of his friends and family seemingly love the game, Readings would mortgage his house to be able to produce around 5,000 copies of the game, which he would initially sell out of his barbershop and later had it sold through businesses after traveling and showcasing the game around the country. And this bet would seemingly pay off, as within no time 5,000 copies had been sold and Merle was having more packs printed. And with its success, he would eventually sell it to a man by the name of Robert Tazak. And with this help, Uno would explode in popularity in the 80s, later catching the attention of well-known toy brand Mattel, who would buy it in 1992, and to this day, the game remains a staple card game for old and young players across the world. The 90s would begin a new era of cards. Now, for a while, there have been a few types of cards to exist. Playing cards, collectible cards, Hallmark birthday cards, lots of cards for sure. But in 1993, we would finally see a combination of playing card and trading card with the release of Magic: The Gathering. Now, from what I understand, Magic does often get credited as one of the first trading card games, but from what I've researched, there used to be games that could be played with baseball cards, most notably one made by the previously mentioned baseball card and candy producer Topps. But from everything I've seen, the game functioned more as a board game where you'd randomly draw cards from a deck, and that would cause certain events to happen. So although it could be considered the first trading card game, the first real trading card game was undoubtedly Richard Garfield's Magic: The Gathering. Now, Garfield had always been a big fan of board games, first introduced to Dungeons & Dragons, which would spark a desire in him to explore more games and make some of his own. One of the first games he produced would be a card game called Five Magics, inspired heavily by a board game called Cosmic Encounter. From here, he would go on to create a variety of other games, eventually trying to publish a game called Robo Rally with a friend of his named Mike Davis. Davis had connections with a new board game publisher called Wizards of the Coast, and so Davis and Garfield would both pitch Robo Rally to Wizards of the Coast in 1991. Now, Wizards was still fairly new to the scene. They saw potential in Garfield's work, but thought it would be too costly to produce their game, so they instead challenged Garfield to make a new game that was 1. Easier and cheaper to produce, and 2. A game that could be played in quick 15 to 20 minute sessions. So, Garfield would go back and forth with Peter Atkinson, founder of Wizards of the Coast, and would eventually get back to Atkinson with a new game, a card game, only a few months later in 1991 called Mana Clash, inspired by his previously designed game Five Magics. Over the course of 2 years, Garfield would heavily iterate upon the game, playtesting it with friends and other students at his college over at Penn State. And after a few years of tweaking things and name change and the approval of Wizards, Magic: The Gathering would be officially released in 1993 to essentially immediate success. After debuting some practice games around the country, Garfield and Wizards would sell almost all 10 million of their initially produced copies only a few months after its release, to the point where they actually had to slow down advertising as they could not keep up with the demand. And from there, Magic would not only be ingrained in history, but would inspire an entire genre of similar games. Over the next few years, we'd get a few trading card games or TCGs for a bunch of popular franchises. We got one for Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Star Wars. But eventually in 1996, a new titan would enter the scene: Pokemon. After the monumental success of some of the first Pokemon video games, and of course the immediate craze that followed it, a Pokemon card game was quickly produced and released through Media Factory in Japan. And funnily enough, it was published in the US by Wizards of the Coast, and would absolutely crush their Magic sales, and this would only further happen after the release of the Pokemon cartoon the following year. The next titan of the TCG scene would be Yu-Gi-Oh! In 1999, and I'll be honest folks, when I was a kid, out of the big three, I was actually a Yu-Gi-Oh! Guy, I can't lie. A few years after the release of the manga by Kazuki Takahashi, meant originally to be a parody of Magic: The Gathering, Konami would pick it up and release an actual card game in 1999 in Japan, with it eventually coming over to America in 2002, only a year after the release of the TV show in America in 2001. This all culminated in Yu-Gi-Oh! Being another great in the TCG Hall of Fame, cementing itself into history as well as my mom's basement. Those cards are still sitting down there. I should probably go grab them, to be honest. And although the physical medium of cards had entered a new era of popularity, one thing that can't be glossed over is the digital. Now, card games have been available on computers and consoles for a good while at this point, with Solitaire being the first made available and bundled with Windows in 1981. But with the new releases of TCGs in the 90s, many of these games would receive digital counterparts that typically allowed players to play a solo version of the game against CPUs, such as 1997's Magic: The Gathering for PC, 1998's Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color, and 1998's Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters for the Game Boy. These games would not only help to further expand the popularity of its franchises, but now introduce the ability to not only collect cards physically, but digitally as well. And at least for now, this didn't have a huge price tag associated with it. The 2000s would also be a huge decade for poker, making a triumphant surge in popularity partially due to the previously mentioned World Series of Poker, which saw a spike in popularity in the early 2000s. Mainly after an accountant quite fittingly named Chris Moneymaker would, through an online poker tournament, land himself a seat at the World Championship of Poker and take home the grand prize, causing the poker community to go through what was seemingly called the Moneymaker effect. Chris was able to prove to the world that even your average Joe can make it to the big leagues against some of the most dangerous men in the world of poker, something that the industry fully capitalized on to push more people to attempt the unrealistic climb to the top. For this reason, and of course due to the increasingly improving quality of internet, real life and more notably online poker tournaments would see a huge spike in popularity, dominating the 2000s until 2006, when there was finally a crackdown on these online sites in the United States with the passing of the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006, causing massive online poker platforms to leave the United States, with a massive drop in popularity for the game overall coming soon after. With the hole left by these new legislative decisions and of course the advent of high-speed internet, the games industry would begin to expand into producing multiplayer digital card games, with one of the biggest landmarks for the field being of course Hearthstone. Hearthstone, as you're more than likely already aware of if you've gotten to this point of the video, is a digital card game that was released in 2014 by the, at the time, well-respected studio behind the Warcraft, Diablo, and StarCraft franchises, Blizzard Entertainment. Hearthstone would be a game available to play online and would take characters from the massively popular Warcraft universe to battle it out in head-to-head combat against real players all around the world. The game would be heavily inspired by Magic, and in fact, it was extremely similar to Magic. And I remember when this thing dropped, I was hooked. I was like in 6th or 7th grade, and I was playing that thing on my iPad pretty much non-stop, just doing it out against the CPUs because I was really bad at the game. Still a good time though. And other players seemed to have the same experience, as the game would end up being a massive success, accumulating 10 million players only a few weeks later after its release, and generating Blizzard a stupidly large amount of money from pack openings and other microtransactions. And in the games industry, where there's money, other companies will follow. The next few years would see the expansion of the digital card game genre. We had card games inside of video games with The Witcher 3's Gwent, which would actually fully expand into its own game in the future, a new release of a digital Magic card game with Magic the Gathering Arena, as well as a few brand new online card games that would rise and fall, one of my favorites being Duelist. Rest in peace to the GOAT. However, over the years, as we would begin to get up to the present day, more and more of these digital card games would become flooded with microtransactions to the point where sometimes, just like their real-life counterparts, it was incredibly pay to win. But unlike real life in these digital card games, you couldn't use your mom's printer to proxy a $60 card. And in these games, you could rarely even outright buy these cards, and very quickly, these games would become a hotspot for pack openings and gambling addiction, as these games raked in ludicrous amounts of money. And as card games have continued to grow in popularity, not just online but in real life, we've seen a massive rise in scalpers looking to profit off the hobby by taking cards away from people who actually want to play the game. Most recently in the news, and you've probably seen this, you've seen swarms of people at places like Costco looking to buy the latest Pokemon releases and selling them for massive markups. Now, outside of just scalpers, we've seen some other greedy and questionable decisions from the card game companies themselves. Magic the Gathering in particular in recent years facing some valid criticisms over the Fortnitification of their game, as well as certain card set re-releases that have just felt lazy or stupidly overpriced. Now, there have been bits of hope in the online card game space, like with Marvel Snap, which had originally claimed to have systems to ensure the game wouldn't be pay to win with the opportunity to easily earn cards. But a while after its release, this game and others like it have a very interesting way of always pushing consumers towards spending money. From the days of the Game of Leaves in ancient China to $99 card bundles, card games have come a long way from where they used to be. Although I do have some grievances with the business practices, especially from current card games, digital and physical alike, cards and the games that sometimes surround them have continued to bring people together, creating new communities for collectors and players alike. And even though modern card games have their moments of arguably being overpriced, the 52 card deck has stood the test of time as a cheap option with an almost limitless amount of games to play developed across the past millennia of human history. So I guess the only thing we have to think about now is what great card games might be coming next. Thank you all for watching this month's video. This was a bit longer than I was expecting it to be, honestly. There's so much history to cover with this stuff, so there's probably some stuff I could have dived into a bit more, and I might in the future, heads up, but I didn't want this to end up being too long. The main card games I've been playing right now is Balatro. Shit is banging. Highly recommend it if you haven't somehow heard about it already. I've also been getting into Commander a bit more with Magic. Very fun with friends, I can't lie. I think I've been yapping enough, though. You know the drill. A massive thanks, of course, to this month's patrons. Mads, Dave the Unknown, Griff, Einar Anderson, Turmeric, Maddie Grady, Zarl Dunking, Kenny, Daddy Yam, Bup1, and Oliver. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for enabling my cardboard addiction. Your sacrifice does not go unappreciated. Thank you all, as always, to everyone else for watching. I hope you liked it, even if this was kind of maybe a bit all over the place. I don't know. I'm gonna stop talking now. I need to give my voice a rest, to be honest. So I guess until next time, take care.